Hi everyone, this video goes with Lab 2 classification of tissues. And there are four major classes of tissues. So there's muscle tissue, nervous tissue, epithelial tissue, and connective tissue. We're going to start with kind of the most familiar for most people, and that's muscle. So all muscle tissue contracts and produces body movements. It doesn't matter if it's skeletal muscle or cardiac muscle or smooth muscle. So skeletal muscle, obviously, it forms the muscles that move our bones like levers. Cardiac muscle pumps our heart, and smooth muscle is used to constrict any of the tubes, so our blood open and constrict our tubes, our blood vessels, our GI tract, those types of things. And so for this lab, you need to be familiar with skeletal muscle. When we do the muscle lab a little bit down the road, we'll go through those three different types of muscle and how you can compare and contrast those. Right now, you just need to know about skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle is multinucleate. That means that one cell has many nuclei. And so right here, this long cylindrical thing is a cell. A muscle cell can be very long. Think about how long our quadricep muscles are on the front of our upper leg. So that goes all the way from the inguinal region all the way down to your kneecap, that patella. And the muscle fibers, which is the name for a muscle cell, can be that entire length. So they can be, 15 inches long. So they need lots of nuclei because they need to be able to get information from one, and instead of having one nucleus, that would take a lot of time to get information from that one nucleus all the way to the end of the cell. So we have multiple nuclei here. You see striations, and the striations are kind of your first hints at the structure that allows for contraction. We see that the cells are parallel to one another, and muscle tissue is voluntary. We have to tell the skeletal muscle that it needs to contract. Cardiac muscle and smooth muscle is involuntary. Next, we're going to move on to nervous tissue. And nervous tissue is categorized as tissue that is excitable, right? And so nervous tissue sends electrical signals down its cell membrane. Those signals are converted into chemical signals, and then they get sent back down as electrical signals, kind of over and over again throughout the chain of neurons. So here we can see a neuron. And another thing that nervous tissue has are support cells. They're called neuroglial cells. And neuroglial cells, you can see these nuclei over here. You can also see them, a bunch of dots over here. And those are all the support cells supporting these neurons. I always think that neurons look like fried eggs with arms sticking out of them. And so that's a helpful visual for me when I'm thinking about nervous tissue. And so, just again, nervous tissue includes neurons, the cells that transmit signals, and neuroglia, the cells that support the neurons. We have kids playing tag while I'm doing this video.
Not cheating. Sorry.
It's okay. Next, we're going to talk about epithelial tissue. And epithelial tissue and connective tissue are the most complex tissue classes that we study. Epithelial tissue is always lining something. Like our skin is epithelium. It's on the outside. If you open up your mouth, that moist tissue that you see, that's epithelial tissue. Lining your lungs is epithelial tissue. Lining the inside and the outside of your blood vessels, epithelial tissue. So what's consistent about epithelial tissue is that so these are epithelial cells. And there's always a surface of the cell that does not touch another cell. See that, and that surface is called the apical surface. The apical surface is free. It's not attached to anything. Okay. At the bottom, we have the basal surface, and the basal surface is attached to something. The basal surface is attached to what's called the basement membrane. The basement membrane is found at the bottom of all epithelial tissue. Okay, and it has two separate layers. There's a basal lamina and a reticular lamina. The basal lamina is secreted by the basal surface of the epithelial tissues, of the epithelial cells, and the reticular lamina is actually formed by the connective tissue below. So epithelium is always going to have a free surface on that apical surface, a basal surface that lies against the basement membrane, and below the basement membrane is connective tissue. Okay. We classify epithelial tissue two ways. The first way is the number of cell layers. It could be simple with one single layer, and it can be stratified with multiple layers. Okay, so here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers. So this is stratified, and here we have a simple layer, just one single layer. It's also classified by the shape of the cells. So here we have flattened cells, and these flattened cells are called squamous cells, and squamous means scale-like. We have cuboidal cells, which are about as tall as they are wide as they are deep, right? More or less forming a cube. And we have columnar cells, and columnar cells are much taller than they are wide. Okay, and as you're working on your tissue field guide, you're going to learn that both, a simple epithelium or a stratified epithelium indicates different function. So the stratified epithelium we see in areas where there's a lot of abrasion, right? So many layers means that if the top layer gets damaged, there's other layers below it. So the outer part of our skin is stratified epithelium. There's two exceptions to those classifications. There's tissue called transitional epithelium. It's only found in the urinary tract, and we'll study that more in 218. And then there's pseudostratified columnar. And pseudostratified columnar is a simple epithelium. It's a single layer, but all the cells are really squished together, so it looks kind of stratified. We'll see examples of that shortly. So here is the simple squamous tissue, and so each of these, you can kind of see, these are the cells. So there's many, many cells forming this wall. This is an example of simple squamous tissue that's found in the lungs. And so the simple squamous tissue allows gas to diffuse through. Okay, here's simple cuboidal. So these are cube-shaped cells. Okay, and you might be like, yeah, but it looks like there's a lot of layers. But so these are all tubes, right? And within the tubes, there's just a single layer of cube-shaped cells. That's how we're defining it. You see cube-shaped cells in things like the kidneys where there's a lot of secretion and absorption. And then we have columnar cells. And so here we can see those columnar cells. And it's important to notice that the nuclei are all pretty much lined up. Okay? That will be important when you're trying to decide, are you looking at a simple columnar or if are you looking at pseudostratified columnar? Here we have these bubbles, and these bubbles are cells called goblet cells. And goblet cells produce mucin, which turns into mucus. So you see simple columnar tissue in areas that are moist. So this is in the small intestine. Here is pseudostratified columnar. And now look at these nuclei. They're all jumbled all over the place. So if you see columnar tissue with nice, neat nuclei, it's simple. And if you see columnar tissue with jumbled nuclei, it's pseudostratified. Here's just a picture of that transitional tissue. Again, you don't need to know this for now. You'll see it again though. And down here is some stratified squamous. So stratified squamous is the only stratified tissue that we cover in this section. And this is the stratified squamous tissue of the skin. So we see these flattened cells, and this is like the upper part of the epidermis. And so we can kind of see the skin breaking away over here. Characteristics that are in common for all epithelial tissue: it's avascular, meaning that it doesn't have blood vessels, so it receives its nutrients through diffusion. It's mitotically active. It divides a lot. Some are ciliated, and those are like the general characteristics. And so you need to be able to identify, state the functions and locations of the 5 types of epithelial tissue that are on the most important points. Those happen to also be the 5 types of epithelial tissue on your for your field guide assignment. And last but not least, we have connective tissue. And I'm actually going to stop the video now, and I'm going to open up a new video that's going to be part 2 covering connective tissue.